don't have to do what I do, which is to choose to put my extremely amateurish dawbles out on Facebook.
So you reached the golden years and you have no more hope and no more friends and you're all alone.
Pluck up your courage and have a go.
And you don't know what to do with your life. And you're like, you know what? When I was a kid, we used to play these games. We used to have these amazing sports, this camaraderie, this connection. I used to be able to call on people, but now there's responsibility, there's family. I don't have a job anymore. Like, what do you actually do in retirement?
I think it's good for us to get out of our comfort zone and try something that is challenging. Even if you don't carry it through, do it for one term.
So this is a podcast about reinvention, about discovering humanity, about having fun, being childlike.
Take a good hard look at the things that you enjoy doing and try it. You never know.
And it's really just about liberating the perception that you're too old to try new things. Cool. All right, we'll kick into it.
Nice.
So the first time, well, not the first time, but on the other side of it, where you're not doing the interviewing. So I'd be curious, how do you start a podcast? Like, what's your, maybe you could do a sort of intro setup of how you might do it.
My podcast is weekly, so I have regular listeners who are there, and we always broadcast at the same time. So I have an opening sting which plays some rather funky music, and then I say, hello and welcome back to the Faster Masters Rowing Podcast. I'm Rebecca Caroe and I'm joined by my colleague Marlene Royal.
It sounds like it's on the radio. Fancy. Okay, cool. All right, well, there's already a bit of rowing. I sort of like to help people in the first part of the podcast to understand what journey we're going on. We're not sure where we're going or why we're doing it, but it's good to know who's taking us. So how would you sort of describe what you're doing at the moment, or what really, ignites passion in your life, or however intro you want to give as a guide?
So the thing I'd like to talk about today is my sport, which is rowing. And as I've got older, I've continued to do it. And this is a sort of broad theme across humanity at the moment. More older adults are doing sport than ever before. We were all used to doing sport at school. Some did it at uni, some were pretty good, went to the Olympics. But the habit of exercise has generally then faded away, except in the most passionate. And what's happening across a lot of different sports, from ice hockey to netball to track and field to my sport of rowing, is that people in their 40s and 50s typically are at a life stage, which you'll understand as a financial advisor, where your kids are getting a little bit older, you get a little bit more free time, perhaps you're earning a little more, you've got a little bit more disposable income, perhaps your metabolism is catching up with you a little bit and you're thinking, oh, I'm a little bit fatter than I used to, or I wish I was a bit fitter. And people are returning to sport or going to look at new sports. And I noticed this trend of mostly over 40s wanting to learn rowing for the first time. And that's really unusual in my sport. In my sport, classically, you'll go to a rowing school, or in the UK, it's really big at university, and people learn for the first time when they're young, before their mid-20s. I'm a good example. I started when I was 19 and went to university. And then typically, if you like racing, which is the major part of the sport for young people, you will go and race and race and race until, your life catches up with you and you make other choices. And some people race through to their late 20s. Some people will stop in their mid-20s. Some go into their mid-30s. Robbie Manson is a national hero here. He's been in the Olympic team before. He's taken some time out. He did some masters rowing, which is what we call rowing for old people, as in over 27, you're a master. And he's now back in the Olympic team this year. So that's an interesting inverse journey. He's an unusual character in that regard. And so spotting that more and more people wanted to try this. And one of the nice things about rowing, it sits in the sitting down sports: cycling, rowing, horse riding. A lot of people start doing these things when they're like, oh, my knees are really jiggered, I can't play rugby anymore, or, netball really, it's, I can't run, I get shin splints, I get injured. So a sitting down sport is also easier on the body. Your body is suspended. Swimming, not a sitting down sport, but also your body's suspended in the water, so you don't have to carry your own body weight. And as a result of this, I started a business in 2019 called Faster Masters Rowing that does two things. Firstly, it's an educational business that sells training programs and webinars and educational things for masters and for their coaches. Secondly, it's a lobbying organisation to advocate on behalf of masters to federations who run the sports in different countries to say, look, what are you doing for this growth area in your sport of people who are somewhat different than what you're used to working with? So that's what I've been doing.
Random. Okay. So is there any I guess, inside scoop or funny story relating to rowing where maybe it doesn't ruin your reputation or anything, but what are rowers like or Olympians like when, the cameras aren't there? You don't have to label anyone in particular.
I've met a few Olympians. The Olympians are a particular breed. Their single-minded determination is unreal, and they carry it through to all other parts of their life. So rowing with them, you have you feel their focus, their concentration is really high pretty much all the time. There isn't a lot of larking around when you're rowing with them. A good story, which isn't actually mine, but comes from a friend of mine called Crystal Osborne, who I used to row with in the UK. She was socially friends with Sir Stephen Redgrave, who's Britain's most famous rower. He won 5 gold medals and 1 bronze medal at the Olympic Games and was the first person in an endurance sport ever to do that. And she said, on a rainy weekend, I'd go around to his place or he'd come to me and we'd play board games. And she said, if he ever lost, he would challenge me to play again and again and again until he beat me. And she said, that's their mentality. So Olympians, if you think of the bell curve of human existence, they're right off the edge of the scale. There are lots and lots of funny stories about rowing, most of which are more about us normal people. Like, I'm not an Olympian. I didn't row for Great Britain. Yes, I am now fit and athletic, but I wasn't at school. At school, I tried really, really hard at a lot of sports. But, being the last person to be picked on the netball court is humiliating. And it is one of the reasons why a lot of girls give up sport too early. And I think if I were to meet my school friends now, most of them would be astonished that I turned out to be the lifelong sporty person.
Wow. Well, on that schooling side of things, what was school like for you? Like, we've had different people where, they have bullying or they're really academic or they weren't really academic or they've moved lots of different places. Like, where were you born for? I can maybe guess, but I shouldn't. So
I was born in London and brought up in a town called Guildford that's southwest of London in the UK. Wow. Okay. And what was school like? School was pretty academic for me. I got into you'd possibly call it a grammar school. It was called Guildford High School. And I went there from age 7 to age 18. So same school all the way through. I wasn't a very confident person, but slow to learn, sort of, not dumb, but the sort of person who takes their time and is a late maturing person. It took me a long time to sort of work out where my little shape space in the universe was. Yeah, a little bit of bullying. There were some twins in my class who had a little gang of mates, and one of my good friends, Jo, came across me in the changing rooms one day in the cloakroom, and she said they were laying into you verbally and you were standing there and taking it like a lemon. She stood up for me, which obviously gave me a lot of confidence, age about 12, because I think she came to the school at age 12, and she and I are still friends today. And then I was middle of the class at sort of 15, 16 when we took O-levels. And then I went on to do A-levels, and I was getting to the upper part of the sort of results scoreboard, if you call it that, at my A-levels. And I didn't do very well. I underperformed even what my teachers thought I should get, because teachers predict what grade you're going to get. for university entrance in the UK.
Oh, do they?
Oh,
so
yeah.
they write it on a list?
Yeah, well, you apply and then you get a covering letter, or this was how it was when I was there, a covering letter from the teacher who says, we think Rebecca's going to get these grades in these, I did 3 subjects. And I went to an interview at Bristol University and I straight out asked the man interviewing me, I said, what did my teachers say? And he said, I'm not supposed to tell you, but this is what they said. And I was like, oh, okay, interesting. Anyway, I underperformed that. And it was a time of particular stress. My grandmother was dying of cancer. My mum worked, she was a gynecologist, so she worked doing evening clinics, dispensing the pill and looking after women's health. And she'd go to work at about 5 o'clock and she wouldn't come back till about 8:30, 9, because she'd do after work clinics. And on those twice a week after her clinic, she would drive from where we lived to Cambridge, where my grandparents lived, to look after her mum, who was, as I said, suffering from breast cancer. And she lived for a really long time. It was very, very painful. And on those nights, I was the eldest kid and I had to cook my dad's tea. There was someone who, I couldn't drive at that stage, someone would pick us up from the train station because we went to school by train, and give my younger sisters, supper and put them to bed. And then she'd go. And then I was sort of, 17, I was in charge until Dad came home. So I kind of didn't do enough revision, didn't do all of my homework. There was just like this sort of constant pressure. And so it wasn't a particular surprise when I didn't do that well. But having got those results and been sorely disappointed, I then sought an interview with the headmistress, who is a doughty woman called Miss Dutton. She is now deceased, but she was a sort of tough cookie. She sort of wore tweed suits and things. And I remember sitting in front of her and I said, Miss Dutton, I'd like to take the entrance exam to go to Cambridge University. And she looked down at her notes where she saw what my results were. And she said, well, the school would strongly advise against it, as school teachers always do, because you could see why. And I said to her, I remember feeling incredibly emotional and saying, well, you can't stop me taking the exam. And she said, no, you're right, we can't. And so she then said, we'll try and support you. So they'd never had anyone ever from my school try and read geography. So there was an entrance exam in geography, which was my favourite subject. And so they sent away for some past papers. So they found out what they were, and she organised the teachers to come and give me one-on-one lessons because I was the only person doing this. And I had two incredible things happen. One was I made a personal commitment to myself, which was I am going to work as hard as I jolly well can. So it was a really short time frame from September, when school starts, the school year in the UK, and the exams from memory were at the end of November, and then you got the results kind of mid-December. It was just before Christmas I got them. So maybe the exams were early December. Anyway, it wasn't very long. I had to do 3 papers: physical geography, human geography, and general geography. So my personal commitment to myself, if I could put my hand on my heart at the end of it and say I worked as hard as I jolly well could, and if I didn't get accepted, I'd know I'd tried my best. So that was an important learning, because I've taken that learning through to lots of other things in my life later on. So the only judge is me. Am I working as hard as I can in this instance? And the second lucky break was my economics teacher called Miss Parkin, she was a compulsive clipper of newspaper articles. She would read an article and she'd cut it out and she put it in a loose leaf folder. And she lent me her folders. And there was one that was called UK Economy and another one was called Third World Development. And I forget what the others were. And she lent them to me and I read them. And from those, I was able to have really up-to-date case studies to answer the questions that were in the exam. Because if you think about it, if something's going into a book, chances are the case studies are at least 2 years old, because they've got to have written the book, got it proofread, edited, printed, then the school had to buy it, it's got to get into a library. And here I was quoting what the World Bank had said last year about whatever. So when they came to mark my papers, I looked supremely well informed, which I was, thanks to Mrs. Parkin. And as a result, I got a minor scholarship to go to Cambridge University.
Wow, that's crazy. What would be, because there's something you talked about, the confidence and having to juggle these challenging moments in life. What's your sort of advice to someone that's wanting to be more confident or to back themselves?
I think there's a bit of self-honesty and then a bit of self-delusion. You need a bit of both. Nowadays, knowing what I know about support systems and a bit more about mental health than I did when I was 19, or even that I did even 10 years ago, I would say go and ask for help, actually, because it never crossed my mind to ask for help. I knew my teachers were helping me in that scenario, and my parents were broadly supportive, but they didn't really have anything particular to offer except to say, we're with you, kid, kind of thing. So it was genuinely that I had to be, looking at my A-level results, you'd have done what my head teacher said, and we wouldn't advise you to do this. And yet I felt that I could do it. And looking back, yes, I was a sort of a late developer, as I said earlier. I took my time to acquire my skills, and they got better and better and better as I got older. And so that was something that I felt inside me, that I felt I was capable of. But I didn't know, and they didn't know. And unless you try, you don't know. So I think that saying to someone, one, definitely have a go. But secondly, get as much help as you can. And the thing that I know now through more recent things happening to me, how important it is to have good teachers. So I've recently taken up a new hobby. I got a birthday present, which was to take travel sketching classes. Now, I haven't done any art since I left school. I did a bit of design, used to do fabric design, and I did an O-level in design. So I was 15 the last time I was seriously holding a notepad and pencil and thinking of drawing anything. And the classes were a lot of fun, partly because I had a very, very good teacher who said, look, there is a method to this. This is how you learn how to look at the shape of something that's in front of you. And if you're listening to this now, look at what's in front of you. What can you see? What's the shape of it? Is it foreshortened because, it's a long thing and it's pointing end on to you? Or is it very square? If you look at someone's face, are they looking straight at you or are they looking slightly side view at you? At what point when you turn your head, does one of your ears disappear? I was like, oh, that's interesting. So you learn to look at things, and then you learn how to apply, firstly, aquarels, which are coloured crayons that dissolve in water, and then watercolour. So I'm learning this travel sketching, and I decided, great, learn something new. This is a real challenge. I'm really not sure that I'll enjoy it or that I'll be any good at it. And as an adult, learning something new is really unusual. If I was to say to you, when did you last learn something that was completely new? Because if you think about your professional career, as an example, mostly you learn something that is a layer that's built on top of a foundation where you already know a lot of things, and maybe you're learning a new product, or maybe, the Financial Services Authority has changed the rules on something, but you know the basic rules and here's a change. So when did you last learn something that was completely new?
I don't know if I'm a good example. I learned Facebook ads last week.
From scratch?
Yeah.
And when you approached that, did you have any doubts that you'd be able to acquire at least some of the skill?
No, the only doubt I had would be, could I learn it quick enough? Because I had a time constraint and I had to deliver something for someone.
And you did the learning that's provided by Facebook, or you went and took a professional class from somebody else?
I YouTube, and then I played around with it, which is what it is.
Yeah. And before that, what was the last completely new thing that you learned?
Completely new? I learned how to build a Shopify website. They're the same thing though. But I get usually I'm expanding on what I already know. I don't necessarily go straight to a new thing, because I find it's not the greatest use of time for me. Unless, it's a satisfaction component. Like, I want to do this new thing and try this new thing. But if I double down on what I know from a professional standpoint, then better things happen than if I fix weaknesses.
It's easier and quicker because you already have that base of learning. So going back to my rowing, I teach adult beginners to row. And one of the weird things about rowing is, unlike many other sports, genuinely nobody can do it when they first go. Mahi Drysdale, he could not do it when he first had a go. And it's because you're handling extremely long oars in a boat that's wobbly. It's like standing on a balance board and trying to do a squat. It's really, really hard unless you are skillful. And so everybody goes through the same learning curve. Some do it quicker than others, but it's genuinely challenging. And so the mindset approaching it as an adult is really different from children. Children are very unjudgmental. You just say, you may remember learning to skip with a rope. It's really hard to learn to skip with a rope. You've got to twist the rope, spin it, and time your jump so your feet clear the rope exactly at the right moment as it passes at its lowest point. That's hard. And children just sort of do this thing, whereas adults have a little voice in their head that you can imagine what it says. Oh, Ryan, that was a bit... Oh, you didn't do it. Try again. Hey, you fluffed it again. Huh. Yeah, well, you're a bit shit at this, And that voice in your head is fantastically destructive. But it's also something that we've learned to build up because it's quite useful in other areas of our life. And it's also, I think, one of the main reasons why adults don't want to learn something completely new. You learn the lesson that it's worth going and finding a good teacher, a good guide, a YouTuber in your case, who really helps you. And that shortcuts your ability to not make easy rookie mistakes. In sport, that is also a good way to go about it. But it's a bit like learning to ride a bicycle. You can't learn it from a book. You've actually got to get on that bike and go and have a go and probably tip off a few times.
Well, it makes sense, yeah. I mean, with the Shopify thing, I called a whole lot of people that I essentially had to build an e-commerce site. And I called them, everyone I knew that sort of knew something about it, and they told me where to focus my attention. And if I didn't have someone that's supportive, then, and I'm left with my own voice, then, you get overwhelmed and you're like, oh, can I do this? So what would be a sort of framework you use to reassure that voice or to help them through these new emerging adults?
I have a very simple framework that let the voice work. It's there for a reason, but you have to train it to be objective, not subjective. So when you skip them with the rope example, you need to treat it as if you're a scientist in a white coat in a lab, and you are going to say, did I time my jump with the rope accurately? Yes or no. So it's yes or no, not good or bad. Did I time my jump too early? Did I time it too late? So you get into a new, more nuanced assessment of what you're trying to achieve, but you don't want to put value judgments on it, because that's where you end up with a sort of negative spiral of self-criticism, which definitely doesn't free your brain up to be as good as it can be at approaching this challenging task. So that's my framework.
Okay. Well, I find leadership or coaching, or whether it's a developing a new skill set, it's like transferable in lots of arenas. So what do you think are the attributes or traits or skills that you have found as transferable from rowing to business or to your life?
Yeah. If you practice something frequently, you get better at it. It sounds very trite, but actually the discipline of showing up and practicing makes it worthwhile. So even the most unlikely looking person who shows up in my Learn to Row class, a couple of years later, a lot of them are very different people physically, mentally. I've seen a lot of people come to rowing at times in their life where they have been very low, emotional problems, personal challenges. And rowing has been the leave it all behind on the bank and get out on the water and have a bit of time where you're not thinking about the other pressures of your life. And it's quite noticeable that in our club we have some people who have incredibly high flying jobs, and that's one of the reasons they like rowing, is they come to it, they're not a leader. You're putting yourself into a new situation. You have to go with everybody else. It's a team sport. You can row on your own, but it is generally, when you're learning, you're in a group with other people, and your ability to combine and blend yourself with the person in front and behind you is to a great extent what makes the boat flow. When the boat flows, you can really feel it. You can hear it. We talk about hearing bubbles going down the side of the boat. There's a rushing water sound. And it's very rhythmical. It's a repetitive sport. You're doing the same movement over and over again, a bit like swimming, but it has moments where you go, oh my gosh, that felt marvelous. And as a teacher, I like people, if possible, to get a glimpse of that feeling on their very, very first lesson. So we send them out in a little, we call it a playboat, but it's a very, very stable boat, which is designed actually to go on the ocean. You go on your own, you'll probably go away from the shore about 100 meters, then you'll turn around and you'll come back again, and I'll be yelling at you, right, turn around now, come back. And then you're out there and you're like, she didn't tell me how to turn around. Oh. And you have to figure a few things out for yourself. And I deliberately don't tell you how to turn around, because in rowing, you are not looking in the direction of travel. You're going backwards. So you sit and the boat goes forwards, but you're sitting looking backwards. So you realise, of course, that you've got to turn around and take a look at where you're pointing, and you've got two oars, and if you pull harder on one than the other, then the boat doesn't go straight. So there's an awful lot of, we call it moving parts. And so you're like, well, how am I going to turn this boat around? And some people will just row with one oar, and some will try and row backwards with one and forwards with the other. And if you've ever been in a dinghy, you've probably worked some of these things out. But it's a great way for them to come back to shore and say, wow, I did that. And some of them will say, you didn't tell me how to turn around. And I said, yeah, but you'd work it out. And you're like, oh, yeah, I did, And it gives people just a little warm smile and a rosy glow. But that feeling is one of the reasons why rowers come back to it again and again.
Interesting. Rosy glow. I haven't heard that saying in a while. Yeah, well, I think if there's a shared task and a shared humanity with a group of people, and even better, a group of strangers, and then also an external focus, so you're focusing on something outside of your mind. Is rowing your meditation, or do you do a kind of meditation? Or?
It is 100% a meditation. You're spot on there. We call it a moving meditation. One of the things about it is that when you're learning, you go through 4 stages. The first is called unconscious incompetence. You do not know how bad you are. Then you start to learn and you think about it while you're learning, and you go to conscious incompetence. I'm thinking about it, but I'm still really not getting it right. Then you move through to conscious competence. When I think about it, I can get it right. And where you're heading is unconscious competence. Even when I'm not thinking about it, I can do it right. And that's the meditative state that you're talking about. But with rowing, you need to switch in and out of it. I used to row in Cambridge in the UK when I lived over there, and the river there is quite bendy, and there are a lot of canal boats moored along the banks. And so I used to row with a lady called Susanna, and we say, at that moment when it's just going really beautifully and we think we're rowing like goddesses, the rule is that's when you have to look around because you're about to hit something.
That's interesting, yeah, because I see, I used to basically rub people's feet that were over 65 in excruciating pain. It was like a equipment we sold. And so you'd see them in their darkest moments in excruciating pain and in isolation because, you're doing outreach. So you're finding people that aren't trying to find other people. And you see this transference of like you lose sort of purpose. You don't have that job. Your family don't need you as much. You don't have the same level of community. I find the women do a little bit better than the men in that. The men have all this work, and then when they finish their work, they got no friends.
And no hobbies.
Yeah, and they die pretty quick, to be honest. So those sort of people sitting at home or at that point of their life where they're sort of lacking that direction, how do they reinvent themselves, or how do they reach out, or what have you do? What was your, like, you've always just had it because you had this hobby, or?
Oh, that's a really good question. As a person, I don't have very many close friends, but I have a very large circle of acquaintances. It's the way I've always been. And one of the things that Masters Rowing has is a social side, always. And a lot of people come more for the social side than for the exercise. And so we'll go rowing. We meet at Lake Papuki on Auckland's North Shore, 7:00 on a Saturday and Sunday morning. And our Saturday sessions are called jamming sessions, a bit like a band jamming, where you can't request to row with anybody. And they deliberately mix everybody up. So you'll be in a boat with different people each week. So you get to know different people. And then afterwards, we all go off to the local cafe and have breakfast and a coffee and sit around and chat. And you don't have to come. But the people who do come value that, I think, almost as much as the exercise and the sort of the community aspect. And this is one of the reasons why federations don't understand masters rowing, because what do masters want? Fundamentally, they'd like some decent boats to row in. That's a challenge because most clubs focus on the kids. Oh, we've got to have the best boats because the kids are going to Mardi. They'd like some coaching. Oh, again, well, the masters don't need coaches because the kids have to have an adult on the water with them at all times, and the masters are adults, so they don't need it. But equally, they need a bit of focus and direction and, improving your skills. Thirdly, some of us like to race, but we like to have events and gatherings, and they don't have to be race events, but regattas typically are races only, and that's it. And you race in a straight line, or you might race down a river, but that's it. So creativity around different sorts of reasons for meeting and getting to know other people. And lastly, the sense of community. We like to have a bit of social. So when we have a regatta, typically included in your entry fee is a sausage and a bun and, and a beer afterwards. And I put that on a Facebook group, which I run, called Masters Rowing International, which, as it says, is international around the world. And I was saying, right, I'm going to be in Sydney. There's a big event. This is next week. Friday after racing, let's meet in the beer tent. There's a tented area at the Sydney Regatta course, 5:30, see you there. And all these Americans writing like, you have beer at regattas? And we're like, yes, why wouldn't you? And it's a very different mindset. You wouldn't expect there to be beer for athletes at the Olympics. Well, of course not. Masters is different. And that's one of the reasons why a federation finds us a challenging group of people to look after, because most athletes are going on an upward trajectory of increasing performance and improvement through their athletic life. Masters are on a downward trajectory of decreasing speed and ability as we age. And what we want and what we value are quite different. And you can see why that's a challenge.
Yeah, it's a good point. There's a lot of value in that. I mean, they're talking about longevity as well. Like, one of the biggest indications of longevity is social integration.
Totally.
So, but then another thing you talked about was lobbying these institutional groups, which, might have a little of inertia, a little hard to get move and adjust them on direction. So what sort of tools, or what's your approach to trying to integrate this new way of thinking to established groups that might not want to take a sharp left turn? How do you go about that? Sounds hard.
So I have directly approached the chief executive of every English-speaking rowing federation in the world and said, just a question, what are you doing for Masters Rowing? And it's a bit like the former Minister for Women here, who said, for equal pay, you can walk into your boss's office and say, do we pay men and women the same in this organisation? It's an open question. It's not directly reflective on you. It's not going to affect you in that respect, but it requires an honest answer. So just by asking the first question should help that person to think, goodness, either I don't know, or yes, we have a committee of people whose job is, and so that's a good thing. And I consider that as just early stage awareness. Then the second thing is to work with a coalition of the willing, is to put the word out to people who are alert to these things. Generally, they are masters themselves, but not exclusively. And to say to them, here are some ideas. So I published an article that's called The Frustrations of Masters Rowers. And this came about because during the first lockdown, a bunch of us got onto Zoom around the country here and said, honestly, we could make the sport better. And we are looking mostly for people who are not like us, because we are all people who are athletic, like to race, have been doing it for a long time. And we're looking to widen the circle to people who've never done it, and different formats, as I alluded to earlier. And so I did a little survey, what's one thing that would improve Masters Rowing for you? And we put it out around the world. And the answers came back into those 4 or 5 frustrations that I mentioned earlier. So I wrote an article, and you then send the article as the follow-up to the chief executive. So it gives them some clues based on, granted, a small research sample, to say, is this relevant in your neck of the woods? In Ireland, are these things happening or not happening? And then you have opened the door to a possible conversation to what could we do differently or better. And then I start with the grassroots end as well, which is where the Facebook group Masters Rowing International comes in. It's a place for conversation and discussion and, questions and answers, which might be, hey, we wade out into a muddy river. What shoes do people wear because my jandals get sucked off by the mud? Kind of things like that. Those things, and then things that can be on many, many different topics. But when anybody joins the group, I say to them, please introduce yourself, tell us where you row, and share a photo. And what happens is people go, oh my God, you row right past, Washington, D.C. and the Lincoln Memorial. And everyone's like, oh my, that's on my bucket list. I'd really like to go there. And so it starts a conversation, usually on a fairly light-hearted topic. But you have the opportunity there to have a whole cohort of people. And someone will say, do you have challenges finding coxswains? And then there's a discussion, and I'm just watching and learning from the real people who are doing the sport. And what happens to them may not be the same as what happens to me, but it gives me a whole load of things that I can then write about, which I then put back into the media and back through. I do an annual survey now, looking at masters rowing around the world. So I can go back to the chief executives and say, things are changing, this is happening, or this has stopped happening. And that's where I see the opportunity for making change.
Well, speaking of change, it's 8:49. So we're going to wrap it up so you can make your call. But there's a concept I've said a few times on the podcast, which is like the longest way around is the shortest way home. So there's something interesting about what you did there about not being confrontational, being open-ended question. So their identity is not challenged. And then fundamentally, whether it's a business or an organization, you're like, well, they must want some sort of benefit. And if you can prove people want something, then, they'd be more inclined to do it. So what would be, I guess, your closing remarks about someone that wants to reinvent themselves and wants to get back out there and have that community and they have that trepidation, and you just go push them over the line, and then you can be like, oh, well, you can check this out. You know what I'm saying? So
if rowing is the thing you're thinking of checking out, Learn to Row classes happen throughout every English-speaking country in the world. The limitation is there a body of water near to where you live? New Zealand, we're really fortunate. We've got coastlines, we've got coastal rowing, we've got rivers, we've got lakes. I would say pluck up your courage and have a go. Like my little art class that I like doing. You don't have to do what I do, which is to choose to put my extremely amateurish daubles out on Facebook for everybody to look at. If it gives you confidence, try and go with a friend. So I went and tried Argentine tango because a friend of mine said, we should learn to dance Argentine tango. And I'm like, why? But we did. And we went to a class in a church hall and we had some fun on a Sunday night. And I began to get a sense of what it is. And no, I didn't continue doing it, but I do enjoy watching it on YouTube now and go and look and see what the professionals are doing. And so I would say it's never too late to try something. And I think it's good for our humanity to get out of our comfort zone, particularly if you are really good, you have raised a couple of kids, maybe you have a job that you're good at, maybe you have a beautiful garden and you're really good at growing veggies, things that you're good at, it's easy to cling to them. And I would say, I think it's good for us to get out of our comfort zone and try something that is challenging. Even if you don't carry it through, do it for one term and see and meet some different people, because I think one of the biggest things politically that's happening in this world is we're getting increasingly polarized and we don't ever meet and talk to people who aren't from our tribe. And so yet, despite all of that, and I know that when there is a disaster or something happens, people help other people. Neighbors help neighbors. You might never have spoken before, but you can see the need and you go and do it. So I think bridging that gap between the tribalism and the neighborliness is incumbent on all of us to try and break that down. So how you choose to do it is up to you. But I think take a good hard look at the things that you enjoy doing and then pick one thing a year and try it. You never know.
Boom. Well, thank you for coming.
Thank you for having me.